Welcome to the October podcast episode of Radiology AI. My name is Dania Daye, and I'm the Associate Editor for Social Media for Radiology AI. Today, my co-host Paul and I are very excited to bring a new episode of this podcast series where we'll be interviewing Dr. Ian Pan. Ian is the world's very first physician and Kaggle Grandmaster. He is currently a medicine intern at University Hospitals Cleveland Medical Center, and he will be a radiology resident at Brigham and Women's Hospital starting in July. His passion is at the intersection of machine learning, data science, and healthcare. We are very excited to have you with us, Ian, today. I will turn it over to my co-host, Paul, to start the discussion.
Thanks for the introduction, Dania, and thank you, Ian, again for being here with us. We're really excited to have you on the podcast. So you've had a really accomplished career so far in AI and radiology, despite having just graduated from medical school. Can you tell us about your background and what got you into AI and machine learning?
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks for having me on this podcast. I'm really excited to be a part of it. So I guess it started when I was an undergrad. So when I went to Brown, I wanted to be a neuroscience major. And so, my first semester, I took a lot of bio and neuro classes, but it felt like something was missing a little bit. And, I missed doing the math and the problem solving that came with it. So the next semester, I decided to start taking some more math classes, applied math and statistics. And I felt a lot more fulfilled taking those classes. I enjoyed doing the problem sets. And, I was always looking for ways to try and be at the intersection of two fields, because I feel like that's one of the best ways to make an impact in any field is to bring something from somewhere else and then apply it to that field. And I felt like, bringing stats, data science, mathematics to healthcare would be a very powerful way to impact healthcare, especially since, people were talking about big data, like genomics, and then all the EMR data. And so I felt like having a strong technical mathematical background could help me leverage some of those advances and then apply it to help improve patient care, patient outcomes, the way we do things in medicine. And so that's really when things started to get kicked off. I started to take a lot more, math and stats classes. I got really into data science. Machine learning in particular is something that I saw a lot of potential for in healthcare, in terms of predicting clinical risk for various diseases or leveraging genetic data to predict predisposition to certain diseases, or even predicting the optimal treatment for patients, the optimal medication regimen. So all of these huge fanciful ideas, which in practice are much harder to actually do. And then I did a lot of data science work, throughout my junior and senior years of college. I did a data science fellowship after my junior year for a summer, which was an excellent opportunity to really elevate my skills. So I think that was probably one of the most formative experiences I had, since I learned a lot of Python and a lot of hands-on practical data science and machine learning. And then going into medical school, I was kind of looking for ways to continue that work. And in the beginning, it was a little tough. I couldn't find the right lab or the right mentor, the right work that I wanted to do. And then eventually I stumbled upon this imaging lab at Rhode Island Hospital in the radiology department with one of my mentors, Derek Merck. And at the time, they were just starting to look into applications of deep learning, machine learning to image analysis. And I think that was about the time, 2016, 2017, where people were first trying to apply deep learning to radiology images or just medical images in general. And then it just so happened that 2017 was also the year of RSNA's first ML challenge, the Bone Age Challenge. And so, Derek was like, hey, if you win this, I'll give you $1. So I figured I'd give it a shot. Even though at the time I was pretty much a novice at deep learning, I had just started learning the Keras toolkit. I didn't really know what I was doing. I was just kind of playing around with stuff, which honestly is the best way to learn, I think. And so, after putting in a lot of hours in that competition, I was lucky enough to place second. And I think that gave me a confidence boost in terms of, being confident in my own ability to pursue this more seriously. and then started doing more projects. One of the good things about that lab and working with Derek was his ability to pull massive amounts of imaging data pretty easily. So I was able to get a lot of cool work done, like thyroid ultrasound nodules, chest X-rays, and the like. And so the next year they had the Kaggle RSNA challenge for pneumonia detection, and I worked with one of my good friends, Alex, on that. And we were lucky enough to place first, which was a great experience. And then that's what really got me hooked on Kaggle. And I think Kaggle has really accelerated my AI ability more than anything else I've done because it forces you to really understand what you're doing, not just from a modeling perspective, but from an entire data science perspective, because one of the keys to Kaggle is understanding the data that you're working with. And so at the same time, I was still doing more AI work with my research lab, doing more Kaggle competitions, going to conferences, presenting my work. And so I think all of this together has sort of gotten me to where I am today.
Wow, that's quite the story and really inspiring. So, were you always set on medicine from when you entered college? Because it sounded like you definitely had an interest in math, you had an interest in trying to be at the intersection of two fields, but was medicine always the plan? And maybe as a corollary, was radiology always the plan?
Yeah, so medicine was always the plan. So when I applied to college, I applied to a lot of the combined BSMD programs, and Brown has one of those programs called the PLME. And so I applied to that and was fortunate enough to get accepted. So I always knew I wanted to do medicine, or maybe, my parents always knew I wanted to do medicine. But I just like the idea of working in a field where you're sort of using science and knowledge to try and make other people's lives better and improve their quality of life, improve their health. Um, and I was always hesitant about pursuing more of an engineering field like math and computer science because in high school I honestly was never the best at math or more of the technical stuff. A lot of my friends were much better than I was, so it was a little bit of a insecurity that I had that I got over when I was in college. In terms of radiology, that was never always the plan. When I first applied to all of these BSMD programs, I wrote about how I wanted to be a psychiatrist. And, at the time, that's really what I wanted to do. And then, sort of as you go through college and medical school, you find out what you like and you don't like. I think I finally decided on radiology probably mid to late third year of medical school because I was still doing a lot of AI work at the time, but wasn't 100% sure if I wanted to do radiology clinically. But I think at the end of my third year, I realized that it'd probably be the best fit for me, all things considered.
Wow, well, we're certainly glad to have you in our field. I think we're lucky to have that opportunity. So I want to shift gears a little bit to talk about some of the research that you've done and some of the articles that you've published in the Radiology AI Journal. And you mentioned that in the first RSNA Machine Learning Challenge, you placed second in the challenge to develop models for bone age prediction. And since then, you've actually published a couple of papers in our journal further investigating nuances of this task. And one of these was evaluating the utility of using ensembles with different methods to improve overall predictive performance. And the other was evaluating an alternative deep learning based method for bone age assessment using pediatric hand trauma radiographs. Can you tell us a little bit about the motivation for these works and what your main findings and takeaway points were?
Yeah, so the first article about ensembles, it was actually motivated by so David Larson over at Stanford, one of the pediatric radiologists who helped organize the challenge, was interested in trying to leverage sort of the metadata from the results of the challenge, where we had the predictions of all the different submissions. And then we were just playing around with it initially, and we were trying to find out, what combination of models gave us the lowest error. And so we decided to turn that into a paper because, we all know in machine learning that ensembles can improve your performance by a couple percentage points. And intuitively, we know that models that are less correlated with each other, so, different types of models probably do better in combination than models that are very similar, right? Because you kind of approach the problem from different angles. And so you'd think you get a little more boost by combining heterogeneous models. And so we just wanted to test that intuition and this competition was the perfect way to do that, right? Because people are just doing their own thing. You get a lot of submissions, so you can really test out like what combination of models work well together. And because it was a regression task, you can actually compute the correlation between predictions and use that as a measure of sort of how dissimilar models are. So two very high performing models that have a low correlation with each other should, in theory, have a better performance when combined than two models that have very high correlation with each other. And so we saw that this bared out in the work that we did, which was pretty cool. Basically, one of the competitors, Hans, who placed fourth, he used a non-deep learning approach, which he had been working on for years. He has a company from it, and so that was one of the best models to combine the deep learning approach with, just because it was from a different kind of perspective and a different modeling strategy. And then for the second article about, alternative method for bone age assessment, I thought that was a really exciting piece of work that we did and one of my favorite AI articles that I've written because it's something different. It's not your standard classification task. It is like a standard regression task, but the motivation and the intention behind it is a little bit different. So the idea with bone age is it's pretty much strictly a pattern matching task, right? When we read bone age studies, we look at the Grulich and Pyle atlas and we try and figure out which radiograph in that atlas looks most like the radiograph that we're reading right now. And this was constructed on like a bunch of like suburban white kids in Ohio or something like that back in the 50s, and we're still using it today. But again, basically, they looked at a population of normal kids and then determined that this is the normal for each age. So the first question is that relevant today, 50 years later in such diverse populations that we have in this country? And second, like we have so much more access to data and models that are really good at pattern matching, essentially, like these deep learning models. So the idea was, why don't we just completely automate the process by collecting a very large sample of normal hand radiographs where we know the chronological age of these kids, and then we can sort of equate that to the bone age. Now, people might have issues with that, but that's a different discussion. And essentially, redefine how we do bone age in that way. And I thought that the work that we did was pretty cool in that we were able to show that it did better on sort of the local data that we got from Columbia University, which makes sense, right? But also that it did better on the Rhode Island Hospital data from our Hasbro Children's Hospital, which is a different population in a different region. And though you could see aspects of overfitting because the error was higher than on the Columbia test data, it still did better than a model trained on Grulich and Pyle labeled data, as well as radiologists who were using the Grulich and Pyle atlas to label the data.
Yeah, no, thank you for that overview. I think all of that's really interesting. That reminds me of a research letter that Kurt Langlotz was senior author on the JAMA recently. It was basically a systematic review of deep learning studies and looking at where the dataset populations came from. And they found that basically they came by and large from three states: California, New York, and I think it was Massachusetts, so in the Boston area. I'm curious, do you think that, given that this model was trained on radiographs from Columbia and New York City, tested on images from the Northeast, do you think that this would generalize to other parts of the country, or let's say even outside of the US? Or do you think that, the alternative, which I think some people are starting to propose, is maybe we should be training models locally, even for things that may seem cut and dry, like bone age?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think it has the potential to generalize to other regions of the United States and even beyond the United States and other countries. Though you'll probably get worse performance because the question is like, does Grulich and Pyle generalize to regions outside of where that population was collected? Regardless, we've been using it here and in other countries as well. But I definitely agree with the point that, there should be some local training of deep learning models based on like region or institution, which is a lot of times limited by the amount of data they have access to, right? If you only have like a couple hundred studies, like you can't really train a good model on that. So in that sense, you kind of have to rely on models collected or trained on data collected from much larger heterogeneous populations. But I think, one of the things that we talked about in the discussion of that article was that this sort of paves the way for maybe region-specific bone age models. So maybe you can't get enough data from your own hospital to train a good bone age model, but you could pool data from multiple hospitals in the region or across multiple states, like West Coast versus Midwest versus Northeast, and then sort of see if that does better than taking a model from a further region of the United States and then applying it, like, for example, a Northeast trained model on like a West Coast model. Um, and then it's a question of like, is it the population that's different, or is it the way the imaging is collected and analyzed that's different? But I guess those are questions for future research.
Yeah, definitely. And speaking of future research, or rather current research, there's obviously been a lot of articles published in the AI space in radiology journals and general medical journals. Um, what articles or area of work is most exciting to you right now and what you've been reading?
Yeah, so I recently tweeted about this paper by Jeff Rudy and his colleagues, where they were able to create like a machine learning model that could predict differential diagnoses in brain MRIs. But it was really cool because first, they didn't have a lot of data, but they got really good results. And second, they used deep learning as a component of the model, not like the be all end all of the model. So they used it to like extract features from the MRIs and then incorporated it into this Bayesian model with other clinical variables, and then was able to produce like basically a differential diagnosis, like the top diagnosis in top three, and it did really well, pretty much as well as neuroradiologists. And I thought that was really unique because it's a little bit different, and it also makes for a more interpretable model than just your standard black box convolutional neural network. So I thought that was really neat. And then I recently saw a couple of articles out of Stanford, one written by my friend Yuhao, who works with Kurt Langlatz, and then another by Pranav, who does a lot of good work with Matt Lundgren and the Amy group. And so basically, these two papers were focused on pre-training models for medical imaging, and so leveraging large amounts of unlabeled data or weakly labeled data. So Yuhao's work, he does a lot of NLP, was basically training or pre-training models using the text from the reports rather than, like a classification label like ones and zeros. And they were able to show that it had pretty significant benefit as compared to ImageNet trained models, or definitely models from scratch. And then the other paper was basically showing that you could apply some methods of self-supervised training to medical imaging. And so I think they used the Checksburg data set, but treated as sort of like a large corpus of unlabeled data, and then pre-trained on that data set, and then showed that it also did significantly better than ImageNet pre-trained models in a low data regime. So whenever I see these papers that are trying to leverage all of the large amounts of data that we have in radiology, much of which is unlabeled, it's always really exciting to see that, because I think that's where we really need to head if we're going to be able to take full advantage of all the imaging data we have access to.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for sharing that. I'm sure it's going to be really interesting to our listeners out there. I wanted to ask a couple of questions from your perspective, because I think you've got a pretty unique time point in your career. You just graduated medical school, you've been through the residency process, but you're also in the middle of clinical training. And one thing that we've seen in our field is several survey studies showing that concerns about AI replacing radiologists might discourage medical students from entering our field. And yet you seem to embrace both radiology and AI really with open arms. So what's your perspective on this premise of AI replacing radiologists? And did this at all enter your mind or affect your decision when you decided to enter radiology?
Yeah, so I think it's definitely naive to think that AI can replace radiologists. The people who are saying this are not radiologists, so they don't really understand the work that we do. It's much more than just, labeling an image like a deep learning model does. There's a lot of synthesis of clinical data. There's, you know, so many different types of studies, and to imagine that in its current state, deep learning could replace radiologists, I think is definitely naive. That being said, I think it's reasonable to be worried about radiology as a specialty going forward in the age of AI. But I don't think we need to be more worried than any other specialty. Like we don't know where AI is going to be 10 or 20 years from now. So I think everyone should be a little bit worried about their job in light of AI, but that's sort of a beside the point. I guess what I'm trying to say is that medical students who are considering radiology but afraid that AI might replace them, they really shouldn't be. And I think AI is definitely going to enhance radiology more than it's going to threaten it because it's going to be able to let us practice at the top of our license, hopefully automating away some of the tedious tasks we have to do. And hopefully that's going to be true for all of medicine, not just radiology. I will say that I think one of the risks of AI in radiology is that it could further the commoditization of radiology, where people start to think of imaging more as just like another lab test. And so then us as human radiologists sort of are taken out of the equation in terms of like the patient care team and all that stuff. So I think AI may make it easier for that to happen. And as radiologists, we need to be cognizant to make sure that we insert ourselves properly into the patient care team so that we're considered a valued member of that team. For me specifically, AI was one of the major reasons I decided to go into radiology. And so it was probably the opposite effect for me. And, hopefully we'll see more of this kind of like hybrid kind of medical student who has really good technical skills and is interested in machine learning. And hopefully they go into radiology as well.
Yeah, so on that note, what advice would you give to radiologists in training or medical students interested in learning more about AI so that they can maybe step into that role?
Yeah, so I think the first decision point you have to consider is whether or not you want to code. And I would definitely recommend learning how to code. I mean, it's easier said than done, but it also is not as hard as people make it out to be. You just got to put in the time. It's like learning any new language, right? You just kind of have to put in a consistent amount of time on a daily or every couple of days just to make sure that you're really reinforcing your knowledge. After you make that decision, it's really just getting an understanding of the basics. And so there are a lot of resources out there. That's another reason why I like this field so much, because there's so much free stuff you can learn from. There's a Coursera specialization called AI in Healthcare that Stanford has recently put out. So that'd be a good starting point, regardless of whether or not you want to code. Just understanding like how a model is built is really important, like the data collection process, training, validation, tests, like testing on other institutions' data sets, generalizability, because then you're in a good position to really interrogate a model. And I think that's where us and radiologists can really make a difference in this model development process, is to be very critical of any model that we see, because there are just so many ways that things can go wrong. Like you can easily overfit to certain things in your data set. There's a lot of bias present in the way we collect data that we don't really comment on in the research articles, but once they get out into clinical use, we'll start seeing a lot of these issues arise, I think. And so understanding how the model is put together is going to be really important in terms of you as a radiologist, and hopefully AI expert will be able to contribute to that field. And I think like fast.ai is an excellent resource. Kaggle is one of my favorite resources. But really, like, if you just Google like intro to machine learning stuff, you'll find something that works for you. I was a big fan of the Stanford course, CS231N, for convolutional neural networks. I thought that was a great resource. Even for people who aren't very technical, you can kind of gloss over the technical details just to get a good understanding of it. But I think there are a lot of ways to learn, and it's just a matter of motivation and effort.
Yeah, no, thank you. I'm sure that's going to be super helpful to our listeners out there. I think it's really interesting because I think in the new latest Fast AI release, they actually have a medical like subsection with separate modules and that might be applicable to radiology. So as we near the end of our time, in the last couple of minutes, I wanted to ask you, what are you most excited about for the next decade in radiology AI or informatics, or pretty much anything on your mind over the next 10 years or so?
Yeah, I think the most exciting part is going to be seeing how these AI models start to actually influence the way we do radiology. Because right now, you're seeing a lot of like papers published. There's a lot of radiology startups, but the adoption is not quite there. And so hopefully within the next 10 years, we're going to see more of these models being used in practice. And then we can sort of figure out what the best way to use them is going to be. I know there was big news recently that Viz AI, their Elvo detection platform, was approved for reimbursement by CMS. So that's going to be a big step forward in terms of getting institutions and radiology practices to adopt these models. And then also, for me personally, starting radiology residency in this era where AI is starting to become more pervasive in radiology is going to be interesting, especially as we see how the use of these models is going to affect education for residents, because we have to learn how to read on our own, but at the same time, if AI becomes more prevalent in radiology, we also have to learn how to read with AI, and at the same time, the attendings are going to learn that with us. So I think there's a lot in store in the next 10 years, a lot of uncertainty, but also a lot of excitement around how this is going to affect our field.
Right. Thanks again, Ian, so much for joining us on the Radiology AI podcast. And bring it back to Dania.
Thank you, Paul and Ian, for a great discussion. And thank you, Ian, for sharing with us your journey in AI and for your advice to all trainees looking to get more involved in this space. I think there were lots of very good tips for anyone who's looking to get started in AI and radiology. Before we end, I just wanted to put a plug for the upcoming RSNA annual meeting. Please make plans to join us at RSNA 2020. Virtually connect with colleagues and industry partners and explore RSNA's first ever digital exhibition floor and AI showcase, and access more than 350 hours of the latest science and education from every subspecialty. All RSNA members get free premium access to RSNA 2020, which includes CME opportunities, on-demand programming, and extended access to the meeting content through April 2021. Register today at rsna.org/annual-meeting. To our listeners, thank you for tuning in to our October podcast episode. And don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to our Radiology AI podcast series on any of iTunes, Google Podcasts, or Spotify. Please stay tuned for our next episode.